Bit of a different kind of flip through for you today. Grab a cup of something yummy and pull up a craft and hang out with me for a little bit. I have a story or two to tell you. Hey, it's Care. Welcome to my take at the lake. As promised, I'm going to do a flip through of this book. If you missed it, I recently got it on the free table at my library. And the reason I'm so interested in it is because most of the men in my family sailed on these steamboats throughout my whole life. And my uncle is featured in here. One of the reasons I tell people about this is because, and I started to say this in the earlier video, when I was in grad school in Maine, I was there for an MFA in creative writing, creative nonfiction. And of course we talk about stuff and ourselves and our lives and anytime I told someone that my husband worked on the boats, first of all, they picture a boat like this. That's what I pictured when I was a kid. Captain Ron. When I talked about or thought about my uncle working on the boats, I pictured Captain Ron. Sunshine, rum, blue skies, swimming, I had quite an eye-opening when I didn't go to pick him up ever until I was 21. I'd gone to the cement plant but didn't make the connection or the disconnection between the boats and Captain Ron. When I was 21, I had to go pick him up from the boats when he was coming home for a couple of days. And that was a whole eye-opening, and I'll tell you about that in a few minutes. But when I would tell people that my husband worked on the boats, they would picture a boat, and then I'd say, no, it's actually a freighter. It's a steamship. They looked at me like I had two heads. And the comment was always, oh my God, I didn't know they still did that. I thought that went out in the 1800s. We see cargo ships all the time on the news. Those great big ocean vessels, they're flat and they carry all those semi-truck beds or trailers, container ships, I guess they're called. That's the same thing, except it's on the ocean. On the Great Lakes, they carry things like taconite. Our cement boats, of course, carry cement, but they also carry gypsum that is it one of the ingredients in concrete? They haul oats, they haul salt. If you live in a place where it snows and your city salts the streets, these boats carry the salt from these great big piles to their destination. The boats themselves, many of them were made in the late 1800s, early 1900s. There are, of course, newer ones, but a lot of them that are on the lakes right now are very, very old vessels. So I was married to a sailor. My uncle obviously is a sailor. He and my aunt is my god mom, and he and my aunt used to babysit me, and they took care of me a lot. So he's like a second dad to me. And so having him on the boats was just normal. He's been on the boat since before I was born. And it's what they call a legacy job, meaning if your dad is on the boats and your son wants to be on the boats, it's almost an automatic thing. It used to be if your dad was on the boats, you went on the boats. And my uncle got my husband, who was my high school sweetheart, on the boats. It was really the only life I ever knew, was a husband that wasn't there much. Because how this works, in our area anyway, on the cement boats, Uncle Steve was gone, 3 to 5 days, and then he was home for a few days. Then he was gone for a few days and home for a few days throughout the shipping season, which was from early spring, from the first real thaw to the first big freeze. He missed a lot of Christmases because the boats just could get one more trip in, one more load in before they closed up for the season. Of course, every load counts, every load is money, keeps the company going. And so he missed a lot of Christmases, and many Christmases we weren't sure he could just walk through the door during gift opening. We just never knew. Because of course that was before cell phones and all of that. I wasn't going to do this right away, but yesterday was the 48th anniversary of the sinking of the Edmund Fitzgerald, which is one of these boats. Now, a lot of you have heard the song by Gordon Lightfoot, an amazing song, and I'll talk more about that. I have my own Edmund Fitzgerald story. I'll talk more about that later, but let's get through the flip through. And again, the reason I'm bringing this to you is because people think that this no longer happens, but these guys work so incredibly hard. And it's kind of like, for a while there, that dangerous fishing, those crab boat people from Maine who were on a smaller boat, but they're crab fishermen or fish fishermen. Horrible weather, like The Perfect Storm, that movie type job. So you're kind of aware of people being out on the water in horrible situations, but perhaps not on the Great Lakes on these freighters. Of course, if you're from Michigan, Wisconsin, Ohio, New York, you're some parts of those states are very familiar with these. There's a lot of boat watchers who will go wherever they can and watch the boats cross the channels or watch the boats sail by. They're pretty majestic creatures. I was at a week-long watercolor retreat up on Nebish Island, and the host of that, her father was a lighthouse keeper. Their house faced, I think it's the St. Lawrence Seaway, and it was in the summertime, and we were staying in this old lodge, and it was so hot. We had the windows open. I remember a boat went by in the middle of the night, late at night, and it was a boat. Just so loud. This tiny little fishing boat with this outboard motor just zipping up the waterway. And about a half hour later, a freighter went by, and you could barely hear it. Hardly made a noise. It wasn't even that loud, and it wasn't a hiss. It was more of a soft hum. It was crazy to see those. The two, you'd think the little one would be quiet and the big one would be loud. The big one is loud inside. So I got this free from my library, and it is nice and aged. I think this came out in the 90s, 1992. But it's nice and aged. I don't know if you can see it's very light, but it's got caramelized pages starting to happen. And there are different companies. My uncle was with Huron Portland Cement boats, I think is what they were called at that time. Yeah, Huron Cement boats. They changed their name. They were purchased by another company, and they're called Inland Lakes Management now. But there are other boats and companies featured in this book. The Ogle Bay, the steamer Ayers, Burton Ayers, different companies. American Steamship is one of them. This looks like an American steamship boat. They go to Chicago, Illinois, Milwaukee, Wisconsin, Superior, Wisconsin, fire hold, cargo holds. I'm going to move the coffee before I tip it over. Okay, so these are all steamboats. Some of the American steamships, even though it's called American steamships, I don't think they're all steamboats, but I could be wrong. Steamships. My uncle is in the text of the book, but he's kind of like a World War II veteran, like he did his work, he did it well. He was very well respected in his field and amongst the people on the boats that he worked with. He's known across the Great Lakes. Other ship captains know him, other companies know him, but he never talks about it. Kind of like a World War II veteran who it's just not something you talk about. He's not a bragger. He's got some amazing stories, but he's not the one saying, hey, listen to me, I got these cool stories. Hey, he's not that needy guy at the bar. He's the other guy at the other end of the bar who's just minding his own business, but super interesting. If you can get him to talk about stuff, amazing stories. This book has loads of beautiful photographs of these, I want to say majestic boats, even though they're all metal and they're dirty and they're loud. They serve a significant purpose, and they've been around 100 years or more than 100 years. A lot of beautiful lake pictures being loaded, getting their load and waiting in line. This is at Burlington Northern Railway in Superior, Wisconsin. So my uncle's boat, he would get on the boat and he would do a few trips. He'd be gone 3 days, come home for a couple hours, be gone 5 days, come home for a couple hours. But then he'd get, I think it was a week off. It seemed more sporadic when I was a kid. My husband's, he worked for American Steamship and they ran different routes. And so he was gone for 3 months and then he was off for a month. And then he was gone for 3 months and then off for a month. And then they would get as many done in the season as they could. And then all the guys were off for the winter. And by the time my husband got on the boats, he he, like many men who get on the boats, are on the 5-year plan, and they say, I'm just going to stay on 5 years. It's really good money. I'm going to make an assload of money in the next 5 years. I'm going to bank it all, because they can't do anything. They can't leave the boat. They do pull into port, and there are little bars and stuff near these. All these places are in these old industrial parts of towns, you know, like they're pretty much ghost towns. But some of them have little bars and restaurants and whatnot that cater to the sailors, and you know, so they could go out and get a cold beer and a burger instead of ship food. Ship, S-H-I-P as in Paul, ship food. When my uncle was on the boats, you know, back when companies treated their employees well, one of the only decent parts about working on the boats was they'd eat really well. The cooks would buy really good food, and they'd have really good cooks, and at least they had good meals to look forward to. By the time my husband got on the boats, companies were starting to change from doing everything they can to support and do well by their workers so it would reciprocate. They started cutting corners, and the more they cut the corners on the guys, the more money for the executives. That mentality started creeping in, as did the mentality of me started creeping in. So on my husband's boat, they called their cook Hot Dog Harry, because he served them hot dogs almost every meal. Well, come to find out, Hot Dog Harry, when he'd do his grocery order, he'd order filet mignon and fresh shrimp and king crab legs and different kinds of steaks and ribs. And when the groceries came to the boat, and a lot of hot dogs. Let's not forget a lot of hot dogs. When the groceries came to the boat, that particular cook's wife was there. And she would take the filet mignon, the shrimp, the king crab legs, the steaks home. And the guys got hot dogs all the time. Of course, this went on for a long time before anyone really found out. And of course, then they found out and he was fired. Then they had another guy that damn near gave everyone botulism with chicken because he was trying to save money to keep his job. He had to save money. Well, he pulled a whole bunch of chicken out of the freezer for dinner, and they must have had a storm or something, and he wasn't able to cook it. So he put it back in the freezer and then refroze it. Well, anyone knows you can't thaw chicken and refreeze it, and a whole bunch of guys got sick. And so even the one thing that they did have to look forward to, a good meal, by the 90s, they were getting screwed out of even that. And I said I went, when I was 21, I went to pick my uncle up from the boats, and he wasn't on the dock. And so I had to go, see if I can find a picture, something similar. This is close, I guess. So I was down here between the silos and the boat on the dock, and he wasn't out there. So I asked one of the deckhands who was down on the ground. They were tying the boat up to the dock where my uncle was, and they said, "Oh, he's still up top. You got to go up on. You can go up there and find him." So I climbed up the ladder, straight up this ladder up the side of this boat, and this is not a small thing. This is, I don't know, 20-30 feet up, maybe more. Get up on the boat, and I saw another deckhand. I said, "Hey, where's Steve?" And they said, "Oh, he's in here." And so I had to, they kind of walked me through all of these places. They all have these steel doors, and you have to step up. Everything on this boat is steel or heavy metal of some sort, and there's welds everywhere, and every place you have to step up to get into the place, because when they get into rough seas, everything has to be waterproof, and you can't have water running in every place, so they have to have these stop gaps, so when water comes up over these rails, it doesn't go into the quarters or into the ship's the rooms. Holy Hannah, the eye-opening that I got that day, because I went from picturing Captain Ron to, oh my God, this is nothing like what I pictured. It's all very old, very well kept, but they're cement boats. It's covered in cement dust. There's cement dust everywhere. And the engines, they have these huge steam engines. This is down in the engine room. That's the ballast pump. But again, all that metal and all that engine rolling, so it's a ballast pump that has its own sort of engine. This is the instrument board in the engine room on the steamer JB Ford, which is one of my uncle's boats. I should say one of the boats my uncle sailed on. That says Cleveland, 1908 is when that was made. So there's a steering engine. That's what this is. And it says, notice steering engine will be oiled hourly on run, lake, or river. Engine quadrant and rudder stock will be greased twice each watch. Each watch will keep grease gun filled. And there's barrels of oil and grease down here that have to be used every hour to keep this thing running. So this thing makes lots and lots and lots of noise, and that's just the steering engine. There's more engine controls. All these vintage old signs. And then all these guys, you know, they're just the engine crew. There's people upstairs in the steering room. I don't know, obviously I don't know all the terms, but where they steer the boat, there's the captain, third mate, second mate, first mate. But there's also levels down in the engine room, first assistant engineer, second assistant engineer, and then there are lowly deckhands. My uncle started as a deckhand when he was 16 and worked his way up to captain in pretty quick time. I think he was one of the youngest captains on the lakes at the time, though I can't be sure because my memory cannot be trusted. Here's a picture of the old engine. This is the detail of quadruple expansion engine on the EM Ford. So when you see SS on something, SS is steamship. There's the engine room. So imagine these huge, monster huge engines roaring and whirring and working and working. It is so loud down here in the engine room, but the entire vessel is metal and it echoes and vibrates and it's just ridiculously loud no matter where you are. It's so loud. They're out on open water. This is on Lake Michigan. Oh, the pilot house, that's what it's called, where the steering happens and the captain usually lives. A lot of time out on Lake Superior, which on a summer sunny day is scary to me. When my husband first got on the boat, literally his first time out on the boat, I want to say he was on the ST Crapo, and his first run was Halloween. And as I said in the Halloween event not too long ago, we celebrate Halloween like Christmas. We all get together at somebody's house and we exchange gifts and we have a big dinner and then we all get our get-ups on and we go trick-or-treating, and it's a big deal. Well, that particular Halloween I remember clearly because it was husband's first run on the big lake. He was subbing for someone who was off for vacation or sick leave or something, and they were up in Lake Superior. And they had stopped somewhere, and he was able to go to a payphone and give me a call and let me know that he'd got onto the boat safe, because he had to meet the boat someplace else. It didn't just come get him, so he had to go someplace to meet the boat, get on the boat to relieve the guy who was off sick or off on vacation or whatever. He got on the boat, and so he called me to let me know he was there. Well, they got on Lake Superior, and overnight they had a horrible storm, just a horrible storm on Lake Superior. They say the gales of November are the worst, but they came early, and they had seasoned men who had been on the boats for 20 plus years, had put their survival suits on, which is this thing, it's a survival suit to keep, because again, even in the summer, Lake Superior is cold. So in the winter, it's deadly. So it's a survival suit that helps save you from hypothermia. It might have a flotation device. Anyway, these seasoned guys were putting on their survival suits and puking over the edge of the boat, which doesn't usually happen because they've been on the boats for 25 years. They've seen bad weather. This was a really, really bad storm. And that was his very first night on the boat. God love him. He went back. He sailed for way more, and he stayed way past his 5 years because the money is addictive. It's good money, and you get the whole winter off, and you get a month off. And we'd go to Florida every time he got off on vacation for a month or the winter. We'd go to Florida and spend it with his family in Fort Myers. It's just really hard to say no to that kind of money and that kind of time off unless you're there, and it's horrible. So it's not easy being married to somebody who is on the boats. My aunt and uncle had 2 children, and so my aunt, when uncle is away, she took care of all the bills, she took care of all the house stuff, she took care of all the kids stuff, she did everything. When my husband was away, I was responsible for everything. And I told Sandy, we were chit-chatting the other day, and when I was, again, in grad school in Maine, I always thought I would write a book about this because nobody gets it. Precious few people even know that this lifestyle is still a thing. But I already know the title of my book, and it has to do with every time my husband would go away, he'd be gone for months at a time, and he'd come home, stay a few weeks, and then leave and remind me to do all the things. Don't forget to feed the fish, and make sure you get the cat to the vet, and don't forget to cut the grass I'm like, who the hell do you think takes care of this shit when you're gone? I know what to do when you're not here. Anyway, I don't have very many regrets over the course of my life, but one of my biggest regrets is husband and I, we were high school sweethearts, and it started in high school. We would write notes to each other. Even if we were sitting at the dining room table doing homework, we'd write notes to each other so that the parents in the other room couldn't hear our conversation. And we'd write notes to each other in class and give each other notes between classes. Then when I went away to college, we wrote letters back and forth. And then, of course, when he was on the boats, he wrote letters all the time. We wrote letters all the time. And we each kept a journal, an old, just a composition book or a spiral ruled notebook of our daily life. This is what we did and this is what happened. And because you want to talk to your spouse at the end of the day about your day, but your spouse isn't there because he's out on the boats. And again, this was pre-cell phone. And I don't even know if they have cell service. They probably do now out on the boats. But this was pre-cell phone. So you couldn't just talk to somebody. And when the boats were in port, quite often it was the middle of the night. So he didn't want to call and wake me up. Although sometimes he did and we would talk. But he and I wrote these journals. And then when he'd come home, we'd exchange them and read each other's journals. Sometimes we mailed the journal pages in the form of letters. But I had all of our notes from the time we were in high school through the time I was in college, and all his time on the boats. And then we decided we were not going to stay married, and beautiful photography. Here's a good picture to show some scale. Here's 2 guys, and the cargo holds are open, and they're loading something into the cargo hold from the dock. So they're filling it with salt or something. And so they're filling these cargo holds, and these 2 probably deckhands are making sure things go right. They have to haul these huge cables to tie the boat up. It's not rope, they're cables, because these boats are huge and unwieldy. Anyway, I had all of our notes from high school, college, while he was in the boat, on the boats. And here's another really good picture of scale. Here's a man. And here's another guy. They're just these teeny little guys on this huge, huge boat. Anyway, when he and I decided to divorce, we spent 2 years paying down all of our debt and saving money so that neither one of us would have to worry about starting fresh or whatever. So we each had a fairly good amount of money saved, that when we split, no one was in a hardship because of it. So we worked 2 years toward our divorce. We were best friends. We raised each other from pups. It was not a bitter divorce. We just decided we couldn't stay married. And we remained friends for a long, long time. But I met a new guy, and he and I were going to get married. We did get married, and that was just a bad idea, but I threw away 2 garbage bags, 2 black yard waste bags full of all of my notes and all of our letters and all of our journal entries. I threw them away. I don't need these anymore. I don't know. I was not in my right mind. Clearly not in my right mind. I threw them all away. Put them to the curb, and they went away on the garbage truck. Wow. That just makes me want to throw up. I just can't even believe I did that. Not only for sentimental sake, but for writing sake. I will write about my life being married to a sailor. I will write about that someday. And having those letters and all those journal entries of the day by day, the daily grind that you kind of forget over time. Some of the ways in which he phrased it. I'll never forget one of the things he said to me. He said, it's like being imprisoned for a crime he didn't commit. You can't get off the boat. You can't go anywhere. You're on strict hours. You can't do this and you can't do that. You can't go home. And he said, I feel like I'm being punished in prison for a crime I did not commit. So some of it is, still there in my brain, but having his day-to-day stuff would be ever so helpful for that book. I'll have to rely on my memory, which is faulty, and I will now tell you why I believe that wholeheartedly. My own Edmund Fitzgerald story. Leanne, I know you know the words to this, so just bear with me. So the Edmund Fitzgerald went down November 10th, 1975. I was 8 years old. And my mom was very much ahead of her time in that she was going to, we lived up north in Michigan, and she was going to college at Ferris State University down on the opposite side of the state and south. And again, way ahead of her time. She found a way to do distance learning in 1975. She figured out a way to get a real college education without having to move there. She had an 8-year-old kid she had to deal with, and she had 3 jobs she was working around. And so she had to go down to Big Rapids, an exam that she had to take in person. And I loved going to college with her. I think that's where my love of I always loved school, but my love of higher education and academia, I think, came from that experience. Going to college with her just was so cool. The pilot house. Look at all those old instruments and instrument panels and navigation tools and whatnot. I imagine there's a lot of computer-aided stuff on there now, but they still depend on this old antiquated stuff that still works like a dream. Anyway, we were riding down, and when we left home, my grandma said to my mom, I'm really worried. It was starting to snow. She said, a snowstorm is coming in. You should probably not go. And my mom said, I have to go. I don't have a choice. I have to go. And I wanted to go with, so we took off. And it was just starting to snow, and the further south we got, the more snow came down, and it gets dark really early at that time of year. And there's the watchman's quarters across the hall there. There's a nice old typewriter. I'll bet this is the ST Crapo. That might be the typewriter that's in my uncle's garage. I talked about that a few weeks ago. He's got a perfect old typewriter in his garage, and it's from one of the boats. Could be that one, because a couple of these have been scrapped. They've been retired and scrapped. I don't know which ones though. Anyway, we heard on the radio that a boat in Lake Superior had gone missing. Now again, pre-internet, pre-cell phone, all we knew was that a boat had gone down in Lake Superior in a snowstorm in November. Horrible, scary stuff. Now, my mom and I knew my uncle was on the boats, and that's where he was headed. They were headed to Duluth, I think. You have to go through Superior to get there. And we were both worried sick. They didn't know which boat had gone down. Here's where they eat. There's always something out to eat. Alcohol. I can't read the sign. If someone in your family has a drinking problem, you have a drinking... someone in your family has a drinking problem, you have a drinking problem. Isn't that interesting? First aid for choking. There's the watchman's cabin. There's a ladder here to get up into the... what do they call that? Cot. There's a name for that. Anyway, we got to the hotel. We called my mom said the storm was too bad. She just couldn't drive anymore. It was zero visibility. The roads were terrible and she just couldn't drive anymore. So we found a hotel and we went into the hotel, and she called my grandma to let her know that we were off the road and that we were fine. I remember the hotel. I remember the orange shag carpet and the big ugly brown tan colored phone that was bolted to the table with a lock on it. I remember my mom talking to my grandma. And I remember just being sick with worry about Uncle Steve. In the song, The Wreck of the Edmund Fitzgerald by Gordon Lightfoot, there's a line in it that says, if she'd have put 15 more miles behind her, she'd have made Whitefish Point. And that's what my uncle's boat did. They took refuge in the bay at Whitefish Point. You kind of tuck the boats into a little bay and get off the big lake and ride out the storm there versus out on the big lake where the big waves are. Well, the Fitz wasn't so lucky. The Fitz did not put 15 more miles behind her and went down that night. And all that night we had no idea if Uncle Steve was dead or alive. And it was absolutely horrifying. Here's Firehold. You got to keep the fires burning. You got to keep shoveling coal to keep that steamship, that steam engine. It's working on steam. Something has to heat the water to make the steam. So it's coal. So someone's shoveling coal, feeding that engine all day, every day. There's a fire station. Anyway, so I've had this Edmund Fitzgerald story, and there's a sidebar to the Edmund Fitzgerald story. My uncle has a cassette tape of the night the Fitz went down. And the cassette recording is of the Coast Guard, and I think it was the Anderson was looking for, because the Anderson was right behind the Fitz and could see the Fitz, but then lost sight of the Fitz. And that's who said, hey, I don't see her anymore, and called the Coast Guard. And so I think it was the Anderson, don't hold me to that because I might not be accurate, but the Coast Guard and the captain of the boat that was looking for them. There's communication between the two. And when I imagine a November storm on Lake Superior at night, a winter storm in a metal boat, it's very noisy in my head. I hear the boat twisting and the metal grinding and being upset by the racking of the rack. That's what it's called. The bed that they climb up to is a rack. There. It all comes back eventually. They're putting all kinds of coal to the fire hold, all the coal to keep that boat going. My uncle has this cassette and he let me listen to it, and I drove my car. I put it in my car, my little RX-7's cassette player, and I drove to the lake, to the big lake, and I just sat there and looked over the lake and listened to this recording. And it's the most eerie silence I've ever heard. There's no weather. You can't hear the storm. There is no thunder, no big booms. You can't hear the boat, which is odd to me. There's no chaos. I expected to hear men hollering orders, and you have to cry out that you've heard the order, and I expected to hear that. I heard none of that. The only thing I heard was two men doing their job, and they're looking and reporting back and trying coordinates and reporting back and talking to so-and-so and reporting back. The most eerie thing I've ever heard in my life. He gave me that cassette tape. It's now mine, and I treasure it. I'd like to get it on CD and get a digital copy of it, just so there are several copies of it, but I don't trust anyone with it, so I don't know how that's going to happen. So fast forward now, I've lived with that story since I was 8 years old. For 48 years, I've lived with that story. And it doesn't really matter to the story, but around 2012, my whole family was out to dinner, and my mom and my aunt went to the bathroom. I know some of these people. Not him, but him. There's a nice picture of the antiquated everything. This is the engine room of the ST Crapo. Anyway, it was just me and my uncle sitting at the table. And I had had a couple cocktails, and he'd had a couple shots of whiskey. And I said to him, was it scary out there? Were you terrified? And he looked at me, because this came out of the blue. Like, we weren't talking about the Fitz. We weren't talking about the boats. We weren't talking about any of that. And he no longer works for the in the lakes management. He's a lakes pilot now, which I explained in the other video, but we'll briefly explain here. He is a pilot on the Great Lakes, which means when boats come in from the ocean, in order to traverse the treacherous thing that is the Great Lakes, they need a captain who is very familiar with the Great Lakes. And so pilots are captains who have long captained on the Great Lakes. They're now pilots, and they go on the ocean boats, and when they're there, they're above and beyond the captain. They are the captain of the ship until they reach their point where they can go back into the ocean and they're no longer in the Great Lakes. That's what my uncle does now. And that's what he was doing at the time of this conversation. But we weren't talking about any of that. And he said, "What are you talking about?" And I said, "That night that the fits went down, were you terrified?" And he just looked at me like, Are you okay?" He said, I wasn't out there." I said, "Of course you were." "Are you sure?" He said, "Yeah." Well, it was his week off. He was, like I said, they'd work a few days and they'd be off for a few days and work a few days, and then he'd have a week or two off. He was waiting for that boat, I think it was the M Ford, to make its trip and then come back, and then he was going to get back on the boat. So he wasn't even out there. He wasn't even on the boat the night the hits went down. And I'm telling you what, for 45 years, every time, or however many years, every time I heard the song, The Wreck of the Edmund Fitzgerald, I would just sob like a toddler. Just cry. It just makes me cry to think of how frightening that must have been. And, they're all fathers, brothers, husbands, boyfriends. They're all somebody to somebody. Even though I didn't know anybody on the Fitzgerald, it still broke my heart. And to hear that he wasn't even out there, and that memory is so real to me. And I think now, so when Mom and I got off the road in the bad snowstorm, and my mom called my grandma, because this is my mom's memory too, by the way. We share this memory. This is something like the Mandela effect. It's as real for her as it is for me. So we fed each other that memory back and forth for 40 plus years. So my mom came out, and I told her, I said, he was home during the Fitzgerald wreck. He was home, which was right across the street and down 2 houses from my grandma. So what I don't understand is when my mom and I got out of the snowstorm, went into the hotel, and my mom called grandma to let her know that we were okay. Why didn't my mom say to my grandma, "Do you know anything about Steve? Do you know anything? Is he okay? Do you know which boat went down? Have you guys heard anything from the company?" But none of those conversations happened. The only thing I can think of was my grandma was a worrier like nobody's business. That's something nasty. Look at all that oil and grunge and grossness. An end view triple expansion engine from the crank deck of the Crispin Oglebay. And there is just oil everywhere. It's just covered in gunk. My grandma's a worrier from way back, and so the only thing I can think of is my mom didn't want to worry grandma. If grandma didn't bring it up, my mom wasn't going to bring it up. And thereby, we lived with a terrifying memory for more than 40 years, for no good reason. I'm one of those lucky people who have a really long memory. I used to say a really good memory. My earliest memory, I was about a year, maybe a year and a few months, standing up in my crib. I remember it clear as day, and I remember a lot of things since then. Not everything. I don't have a photographic memory at all, but I remember a lot. And I always thought it was a really good quality, reliable memory. But after the Edmund Fitzgerald thing, and I had it so wrong for so long, I don't trust anything anymore, memory-wise. Especially, I read a lot about the memory and how our minds work, and every time we retell a memory, stuff gets lost or stuff gets added, and it changes every single time you tell the story, even though for you it seems like you're telling the same story over and over and over again. Through time, through new experiences, through new input, that memory changes. And what just boggles my brain is that my mom and I share this memory so vividly, and it was completely inaccurate. I guess it's not inaccurate. It is our reality. We didn't know if he was out there. Apparently, we didn't know he was on vacation. So we didn't know whether or not he lived or died. But he was not out there. I've always told the story that my uncle was out there, and we didn't know if he had if it was his boat that had gone down or not. I've always said that story. Part of it is true. We didn't know if he was alive or dead for days until we got home, and then he was fine and, you know, all was well. But apparently we never discussed that with any other member of our family who would have said he was on vacation. Too twisted for colored television. Yes, that's what that is. This was a very different, long, rambling storytelling time of this boat. Look at this. Portside crew tunnel. This is where the crew goes to get where they need to go, back and forth at the end of the boat. All of this is metal. All of this is metal. You can see that it's wet. Even though they have those step-ups, it shouldn't be wet. But you can see that it's wet. Things are leaking and water's coming in here and there. It is just horrible. This is a tunnel showing the self-unloading conveyor mechanism on the steamer J. Burton Ayres. Long and rambling story time, but maybe you found something new that you might be curious about. Cargo holds. Looks all nice and clean and shiny, and holy man, you have to get down in there and clean the holds. So you see these points right here. There's a point and a point and a point. This guy is standing on one of those points to give you an idea of how big these bad bears are. And the guy's got to get down there and clean the cargo holds. I'd be terrified to be down in the hold in case somebody started dumping some shit in there. Oh, I'd be so scared. There's the cables that they use to tie the boats. And again, there's some little people tying that boat to the dock. Those cables snap or something goes wrong. Oh, we're in trouble. There's two guys cleaning the cargo hold. Usually deckhands. They're the low men on the totem pole. Here, this is why I'd be afraid to go in the holds. The holds have stuff in it. Be so easy to get buried alive in something like that. And look at this. It looks like rope, but it's coming down here and it's down here, and that could so easily get wound up around his legs. Pull him under. Drown him in, could be taconite or gravel. Who knows? Could be oats. I do know Raymond told me he would never eat oats again after, and he loved oatmeal. He said after hauling oats, he'd never eat oats again. And a whole bunch of pictures of the guys who live this life. Beautiful. It's just a beautiful, beautiful view of a not so beautiful reality. I'm gonna have my uncle sign this for me. I'd like to interview him. Oh, here's one here at home. This is our cement plant. E.M. Ford. I'd love to write a book about his life, but I don't know if I can get him to talk about it. And maybe if I feed him enough whiskey, he'll let me write a book about it. Because it's a dying art. These boats aren't going to last forever. And what they've started doing, while he's calling it, the book is called The End of an Era, is because, number one, the steamboats, again, they were built in the 1800s, early 1900s, so they're not going to last forever. But they're very expensive to maintain. You have a captain, 3 mates, you have an engineer and 3 assistant engineers, you have watchmen, you have firemen, you have several deckhands. That's 20 some people on one of these steamers. What they started to do was make tug and barge. So the only thing that needs to be manned is the tug. So they go from a crew of 20 to maybe 5, and the tug pushes the barge that's not manned. And so the companies then save all that money in not paying a crew. They pay a skeleton crew, essentially, thereby cutting loads of jobs. So the boats are going by the wayside. They can't last forever, and they're going to tug and barge versus steamship. So a lot of this, it's a dying art, really. I think I've said all I have to say on this, other than the stuff that I have for my books. So maybe one day you'll read a book by me that's about either my life living with a sailor or about my uncle's life. Keep an eye out, because you never know what tomorrow's gonna bring. I'm gonna go grab Bitsy and give her some love since it's been a long time since she's had any attention. I appreciate your time. Follow your curiosity. Learn about things that are new to you and see where that takes you, because you just never know the things you might discover. And that's one of the coolest things, especially if you're feeling kind of down and you're feeling kind of bummed or stuck in a rut, or that, you're in that daily grind and it just doesn't seem like nothing ever changes. And find something you're curious about and study the bejesus out of it. And I don't mean study like college. I mean, follow that curiosity and quench it by learning all you can about it. You just don't even know. It could change your life. Seriously. Mate at the lake. Out for now.
The legend lives on from the Chippewa on down at the big lake they call Gitchagumi. The lake, it is said, never gives up her dead when the skies of November turn gloomy. With a load of iron ore, 26,000 tons more than the Edmund Fitzgerald weighed empty. That good ship and true was a bone to be chewed when the gales of November came early. The ship was the pride of the American side, coming back from some mill in Wisconsin. As the big freighters go, it was bigger than most, with a crew and good captain well seasoned, concluding some terms with a couple of steel firms when they left fully loaded for Cleveland. Then later that night when the ship's bell rang, could it be the north wind they'd been feeling? The wind in the wires made a tattletale sound, and the wave broke over the railing. And every man knew, as the captain did too, 'twas the witch of November come stealing. The dawn came late and the breakfast had to wait when the gales of November came slashing. When afternoon came, it was freezing rain in the face of a hurricane west wind. When supper time came, the old cook came on deck saying, "Fellas, it's too rough to feed you." At 7 p.m. a main hatchway caved in. He said, "Fellas, it's been good to know ya." The captain wired in, he had water coming in, and the good ship and crew was in peril. And later that night when his lights went out of sight, came the wreck of the Edmund Fitzgerald. Does anyone know where the love of God goes when the waves turn the minutes to hours? The searchers all say they'd have made Whitefish Bay if they'd put 15 more miles behind her. They might have split up or they might have capsized. They may have broke deep and took water. And all that remains is the faces and the names of the wives and the sons and the daughters. Lake Huron and roll Superior sings in the rooms of her ice water mansion. Old Michigan steams like a young man's dreams. The islands and bays are for sportsmen. And farther below, Lake Ontario takes in what Lake Erie can send her. The iron boats go, as the mariners all know, with the gales of November remembered. In a musty old hall in Detroit they prayed in the Maritime Sailors' Cathedral. The church bell chimed till it rang 29 times for each man on the Edmund Fitzgerald. And the legend lives on from the Chippewa on down of the big lake they call Gitchagumi. Superior, they said, never gives up her dead when the gales of November come early.